In the 18th century, British ships carried about 3 million slaves from Africa to the Americas. The church fell prey to the temptations of power and money that this trade had created. On the back of the slave trade, Britain widened its empire and became a commercial superpower, with London's Royal Exchange at its heart.
It gives me a secret satisfaction to see so rich an assembly of Englishmen and foreigners consulting together upon the private business of mankind, and making this metropolis a kind of emporium for the whole world.
All of God's creation was open for commercial gain. Trade was centred around city ports like Bristol, Liverpool and London. Their new wealth drew in many people from the countryside. Bristol's population tripled over the 18th century. The slave trade worked in a triangular way. Manufactured goods were shipped to West African ports like here at Elmina in modern Ghana. Here they were sold or exchanged for slaves, some of whom had been brought from inland by African traders. The slaves were then transported in terrible conditions to plantations in America and the Caribbean. Slave-produced commodities like sugar, rum and coffee were shipped back to Britain. Every British institution, including the church, had its fingers in the slave pie.
The Bishop of London in 1727, Bishop Sherlock, declared that slavery was not incompatible with Christian principles. And although there was no theological justification for this statement, I think it was more in recognition of the fact that the economies of Britain depended heavily on the slave trade and slavery itself. If you look, for example, at the South Sea Company subscription lists, the South Sea Company existed purely to deal in slaves. You'd be surprised how many reverends and bishops invested in the slave trade. I mean, it was just sheer greed, you know. It was Mammon versus God, and for a short time, Mammon won.
Government officials supervising the trade made their fortunes from commission. They were able to build splendid estates, some of which had private access to their own churches, as here at Dereham Park in Gloucestershire.
The churches, unlike today, were definitely beneficiaries of support from major trading families. And institutions like St. Paul's did directly benefit from the institution of slavery.
The church even honoured slave traders and merchants who made donations. This statue in All Saints' Church, Bristol, celebrates the sugar magnate Edward Colston, who gave money to restore its tower. Slave traders were mostly devout Christians and saw no contradiction between their profession and their faith. At Elmina, Catholic traders took Joseph as their patron saint because he was a carpenter and could help take care of their ships. They forcibly baptized the slaves before they began their journey, and Catholic Mass was held on board. Christians justified slavery as an inevitable part of life.
It becomes such a big institution, it becomes such a major movement of peoples, so important in the colonies, that people don't challenge it because it's there, and after 2 generations it's always seemed to have been there.
If anything, they thought it was a beneficial activity. Taking slaves from Africa into the New World was at least taking them away from pagan monarchies or pagan control into access to Christianity.
Some Christians even claimed that the Bible endorsed slavery.
People scraped the barrel to find out, to find some justifications, theological justifications for slavery, one of which was an Old Testament story, the curse of Ham, that Ham had looked upon his father Noah when Noah was drunk and naked, and as a result of which God had cursed Ham, that his descendants, his son and descendants afterwards, would be dark-skinned and loathsome. In the New Testament, there was the letter of St. Paul which seemed to endorse the system of master and slave.
Servants, obey in all things your masters according to the flesh, and whatsoever ye do, do it heartily, as to the Lord.
Many people in the 18th century rationalized slavery by conjuring up a divinely ordained hierarchy of humanity.
You had God on top, yes. You had the Son of Man, who was a white man, yes. And then you had the white planters, who were obviously looked like the white man who was the Son of God, and looked like God, who was white in the iconography. And then you had the lesser creatures, the blacks, yes. So the blacks must, so the preaching would go, aspire to that condition of whiteness by acts of piety, by learning the Bible.
Other Christian supporters of the slave trade promoted the extreme view that slavery was justified because Africans didn't have souls and were therefore beyond the hope of salvation.
This is bound up really with the evolution of a distinctive racial feeling, that here are people who are so different from ourselves, i.e. white people. Here are black people who are perhaps at best at the very end of the chain of being, so different from Western society that they scarcely belong to the same global environment, and at worst perhaps don't even belong to humanity itself. And if you can distance yourself from black humanity by saying, well, they're not really humans after all, they're like us in some respects but more akin to the animal kingdom, if you can do that, then you've got a ready-made justification for all the inhumanities that you heap upon black humanity from one generation to another in the institution of slavery.
The Anglican Church put up little resistance to these extreme ideas. It was becoming more a part of the establishment, siding with the rich and growing complacent. It had little to say to the poor. English Christianity needed waking up. The man who took on the job was John Wesley.
Although John Wesley was a loyal son of the established church, he was very critical of it for various reasons. Often clergy were not resident in their parishes, or they paid a poor curate to look after it while they were elsewhere. Bishops didn't visit many of their places in their diocese. They were too busy in London and on political assignments and so on. But Wesley's main criticism was that he wanted to bring vital religion back to the church.
Wesley preached Christ's gospel of love. The Anglican Church criticized Wesley for enthusiasm and closed its doors to him. Wesley built a new church in Bristol, which he called the New Room, and in 1739 the first Methodist service was held there. Wesley took his message out to the countryside. Massive crowds came to his open-air sermons. He particularly appealed to the labouring poor, including fishermen and miners. They were often profoundly moved by his services.
They saw the tears of penitence coming down their cold, grimed faces, and they realised that the Spirit of God was able to get through to people who had never come to a normal church service or to any religious occasion at all.
Wesley took to his horse, riding around Britain, forming small societies of Methodists. He travelled over 200,000 miles and preached 40,000 sermons.
Although Wesley always said he's an auxiliary to the church and wants to stimulate the church, more and more you feel that he is building up an alternative system based on where the population is and sending preachers where they are rather than waiting for them to come there. The whole thing is much more dynamic and fluid.
Wesley was trying to reform society with a message of fellowship and compassion. He distrusted the rich and the corrosive effect of wealth on the spiritual life. By his death in 1791, the Methodist Church numbered many thousands in Britain. Methodism had also taken root in the United States through an evangelical revival known as the Great Awakening. Wesley extended his radical message of fellowship to enslaved Africans. He saw them not as commodities, but as individuals, equally worthy of God's love as anyone else. Wesley became an outspoken opponent of slavery.
In 1774, Wesley himself published probably one of the most important statements on slavery, Thoughts Upon Slavery, as a pamphlet which was distributed in thousands and had a direct impact, say, on slavery in the United States.
O thou God of love, thou who hast mingled of one blood all nations upon earth, have compassion upon these outcasts of men who are trodden down as dung upon the earth. Make even those that lead them away captive to pity them. O burst thou all their chains in sunder, thou Saviour of all, make them free.
One of the rather remarkable things about the evangelical revival and its quite deep involvement in the anti-slavery movement is the way in which it was able to overturn not only a whole Christian tradition which sanctions slavery with various safeguards, but the Bible itself, which apparently accepted it, if not endorsed it.
Public opinion started to turn against slavery. The Anglican Church made no corporate stand, but individual Anglicans, including the Bishop of Chester, openly supported the abolitionist movement. Preachers began to use the Bible as a weapon to end the slave trade.
The coming of Christianity to slaves in the West Indies and into the northern colonies, what becomes the United States, has a tremendous influence on the way slavery is finally corroded. Because what it does, it puts into the slaves' hands tools which they can use for their own advancement.
There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither bond nor free, there is neither male nor female, for ye are all one in Christ Jesus.
The Bible is full of stories about liberation from power. The waters parting in the Red Sea, the chosen people making their escape out of an Egyptian captivity, etc. And slaves would pick up on these notions.
In the New Testament, the crucifixion and the resurrection were very important symbols in the African psyche. In the suffering of Jesus, the African could see his or her own undeserved punishment. Resurrection became another word for emancipation.
Slaves themselves became a vital agent in the abolitionist movement.
They experienced slavery directly and could communicate to audiences who knew nothing of it what that experience meant.
Olaudah Equiano was the African who made the most significant contribution to the abolitionist movement. Seized as a child in what is now Nigeria, he was enslaved and shipped across the Atlantic. After converting to Methodism, he eventually won his freedom in Britain. In 1789, Equiano published his autobiography, which became an instant bestseller.
It is not uncommon, after a flogging, to make slaves go on their knees and thank their owners and pray, or rather say, God bless them.
He was almost a missionary in reverse. He was coming to England with his black text, his black Bible, moving among, if you like, the white heathens who had been accustomed to enslaving his own people and preaching to them the gospel of love.
The days of the slave trade were numbered. Slave revolts in the colonies were becoming more regular. The Anglican Church was no longer so sure Christ would have approved of slavery, and philosophers of the Enlightenment, like Voltaire and Rousseau, attacked it on ethical grounds.
Not a barrel of sugar arrives in Europe that is not stained with human blood. Let us turn our eyes from such an awful spectacle, this shame and horror of humanity.
The battle was taken into Parliament by an Anglican philanthropist, William Wilberforce. He used a model slave ship to show the appalling conditions on board. In 1791, Wilberforce presented his first abolitionist bill to Parliament. But too many MPs and lords had too much to lose. When the bill was voted down, the bells of St. Mary's Redcliffe in Bristol rang out in celebration. But Bristol was a last bastion of pro-slavery sentiment, and Wesley urged Wilberforce to continue his mission.
A few days before he died, Wesley wrote one of his most passionate and serious letters to Wilberforce. Reading this morning a tract wrote by a poor African, I was particularly struck by that circumstance that a man who has a black skin, being wronged or outraged by a white man, can have no redress. It being a law in our colonies that the oath of a black against the white goes for nothing. What villainy is this? That he who has guided you from youth up may continue to strengthen you in this and all things is the prayer of, dear sir, your affectionate servant, John Wesley.
At the end of the 18th century, the abolitionist movement persuaded Parliament to pass two key bills. The first to make trading in slaves illegal in 1807, the second to abolish slavery itself in 1833. The Catholic Church formally condemned slavery as un-Christian in a papal bull in 1839.
When the British end slavery in the 1830s, one of the great drives against slavery in Parliament, in the Lords, in the country at large, was a sense of outraged Christianity on the part of the Church of England and others. And yet that's a tremendous revolution in the attitude of the Church of England. By the end of slavery, they were at the forefront of campaigns against it. Here is an ungodly institution that should be brought down.
The evangelical revival and the abolitionist movement helped transform Christianity into a far more compassionate and inclusive religion than it had been in 1700. And for the first time, here in the Caribbean, Christ and the Virgin Mary were portrayed with blackface.